By late 1944, the Western Front had become a patchwork of desperation, strategy, and psychological warfare. German soldiers, who had once advanced boldly across Europe, were now facing a relentless tide of Allied forces. Yet a curious pattern emerged. Many German troops would surrender to British soldiers without prolonged combat, while fighting Americans with a ferocity that seemed almost suicidal. Understanding this behavior requires us to look beyond maps and battle plans and into the minds of men pushed to their limits. Morale among German units had plummeted. Years of propaganda glorifying victory clashed violently with the harsh reality of retreating, undersupplied, and outnumbered forces. Soldiers were exhausted, often hungry, and aware that the war was turning irreversibly against them. This exhaustion was compounded by a fear rooted not only in survival, but in perception. The British had developed a reputation among German troops for treating prisoners of war relatively humanely. Stories circulated in the ranks of captured German soldiers receiving food, medical care, and fair treatment in British camps. Psychological studies conducted after the war revealed that soldiers were acutely aware of these differences, and it influenced split-second decisions on whether to surrender or fight. The Americans, by contrast, were often viewed as relentless and aggressive. Their tactics involved rapid advances, combined arms assaults, and overwhelming firepower that left little room for negotiation or delay. German soldiers feared the consequences of capture by American units, imagining harsher treatment, forced labor, or worse. These perceptions, whether fully accurate or not, became a self-fulfilling prophecy. They motivated stubborn resistance even when defeat was inevitable. Combat experience further reinforced these patterns. Units that had faced British forces earlier in the campaign often described encounters that were tense but contained, allowing soldiers to maintain dignity even in surrender. Against American troops, however, engagements were often chaotic and brutal, emphasizing speed, firepower, and destruction. Eyewitness accounts from both sides recount German soldiers holding positions to the last round, even when surrounded, highlighting the psychological imprint of previous encounters on present decisions. Propaganda played its part as well. The Nazi regime had spent years portraying the Allies as enemies to be feared and crushed, but subtle distinctions existed. British forces, with their measured approach and emphasis on discipline, were often painted in reports as more reasonable, whereas American soldiers, with their dynamic offensives, were cast as unpredictable and overwhelming. These narratives seeped into the consciousness of frontline soldiers, creating cognitive biases that shaped their actions. Individual psychology also mattered. Officers and enlisted men alike were influenced by personal survival instincts, loyalty to comrades, and fear of shame or retribution. In many cases, surrendering to the British was seen as a pragmatic choice, an acknowledgement of the inevitable, while fighting Americans to the end became a matter of honor or desperation. It is crucial to recognize that these behaviors were not uniform. Context, location, unit composition, and timing all played a role. Yet the overarching pattern suggests a complex interplay of perception, experience, and expectation. Soldiers weighed not only their immediate tactical situation, but also long-term consequences, past experiences, and the stories circulating through the ranks. In the end, the Western Front was not just a stage for military maneuvers, but a theater of human psychology. Understanding why German troops surrendered to one enemy, yet resisted another with deadly determination, reveals the deep, often hidden forces shaping battlefield behavior. This chapter of the war reminds us that warfare is not only a clash of armies, but also a clash of minds, shaped as much by perception, rumor, and experience as by orders and ammunition. As we explore these patterns further, it becomes clear that surrender and resistance were not merely tactical choices, but reflections of fear, hope, and the human instinct to survive under the shadow of annihilation. By late 1944, German soldiers had already begun to notice distinct differences in how they were treated depending on who captured them.
Encounters with British troops often ended in surrender without the ferocity that marked battles against Americans. This was not simply a matter of convenience or chance, but the result of deliberate British tactics combined with the reputations that preceded them. The British Army had spent years cultivating an image of professionalism and humane treatment. Prisoners of war, even those caught after heavy fighting, could often expect adequate food, medical care, and a certain degree of dignity. Word of mouth traveled fast among German units. Stories of comrades returning from British captivity alive and largely unharmed created a psychological comfort. Surrendering to the British was seen as a calculated risk rather than an act of shame. Beyond reputation, the British employed clever psychological strategies on the battlefield. Patrols and units often projected confidence and discipline that encouraged German troops to yield rather than resist. Small gestures like offering opportunities for negotiation or demonstrating orderly conduct conveyed a sense that surrender was not a death sentence. Many German soldiers were trained to respect hierarchy and procedure, and they responded to these subtle cues. Historical accounts describe entire units laying down arms after careful observation of British behavior, recognizing that resistance might only lead to unnecessary casualties. These incidents were not isolated. During the crossing of the Rhine and other late war operations, British commanders intentionally displayed controlled strength, often advancing in ways that minimized shock and maximized persuasion. Unlike rapid, overwhelming assaults, this approach gave German troops the perception that surrendering could be safe, honorable, and even sensible. Intelligence also played a role. British forces often intercepted communications and understood German morale levels, allowing them to tailor their approach to maximize surrender rates. Leaflets, loudspeakers, and radio broadcasts reinforced the message that surrender to the British was preferable, safe, and expected under the circumstances. German soldiers were acutely aware of these layered strategies. Their training emphasized reading the battlefield, assessing risk, and responding to cues. When confronted with a well-organized, disciplined, and seemingly humane force, many calculated that surrender was the most rational choice. In contrast, the American approach emphasized speed, shock, and overwhelming firepower. For German troops, the British method felt almost predictable and controlled, while American offensives often appeared chaotic and merciless. This perception created a mental divide. Surrender to the British seemed rational, almost strategic, while any thought of yielding to American units triggered fear and resistance. The influence of past experiences cannot be understated. Veterans who had fought in France, North Africa, or earlier campaigns carried memories of treatment by both armies. Many had endured American artillery barrages, airstrikes, and fast-moving armored assaults, leaving lasting impressions of danger and unpredictability. In comparison, British advances, though disciplined and precise, rarely created the same sense of immediate mortal threat. Social and cultural conditioning also mattered. British soldiers often adhered to a code of conduct that projected fairness and reliability, which German soldiers recognized and respected. American troops, despite their professionalism, were sometimes perceived as less predictable, more informal, and more willing to take risks that increased the stakes for the opposing side. Even small factors such as language, appearance, or demeanor reinforced these perceptions. The net effect was clear. Surrendering to the British offered a plausible route to survival, whereas resistance against them often seemed unnecessary. Observers noted that the psychological calculus of surrender went beyond simple fear of death. German soldiers weighed immediate risk, long-term consequences, and potential for humane treatment. They acted on available information, whether accurate or distorted by rumor, and made rational choices in a world defined by chaos. This pattern illuminates the subtle but powerful ways military psychology can shape the outcome of battles. When the British advanced with deliberate discipline, German soldiers often chose to lay down their arms. This was not weakness, but a strategic recognition of how to survive when options were limited. Understanding this dynamic helps explain why entire units sometimes surrendered almost intact to British forces while showing fierce resistance elsewhere. The chapter reveals a compelling truth. Warfare is not only fought with weapons, but also with trust, reputation, and perception. On the Western Front, the British effect was a quiet but powerful tool, turning psychological insight into battlefield advantage. By the end of the war, these encounters would leave an enduring lesson. Human behavior in combat is shaped as much by expectation, reputation, and subtle strategy as by tanks, guns, or artillery.
As German forces faced the advancing Americans in late 1944 and early 1945, a striking contrast to their encounters with the British became clear. Instead of surrendering, many units fought with a determination that seemed almost suicidal, holding positions to the last man even when defeat was inevitable. To understand this phenomenon, we must look at the combination of fear, perception, and battlefield reality that shaped these desperate acts. The Americans had developed a reputation among German soldiers for being relentless and aggressive. Their tactics emphasized speed, mobility, and overwhelming firepower, often leaving little room for negotiation. Panzer divisions and infantry alike encountered American armored columns advancing with close air support, artillery barrages, and coordinated infantry assaults that were brutal in execution. German soldiers, aware of these tactics, often believed that surrender would only result in harsher treatment or immediate death. This perception was reinforced by first-hand accounts from veterans and reports circulating among troops. Stories of prisoners being captured, interrogated under strict conditions, or sent to labor camps fueled a sense of fatalism. The psychological effect was profound. In contrast to the British, the Americans were seen as less predictable and more willing to exploit any weakness ruthlessly. This perception triggered a survival mechanism. If surrender seemed more dangerous than fighting, even a hopeless fight became the logical choice. Combat doctrine also influenced behavior. German units were trained to hold positions, delay advances, and buy time for the larger strategic picture. When faced with American offensives, they often invoked this doctrine to justify desperate resistance. Orders from commanders emphasized the importance of holding key positions at all costs, instilling a sense of duty and honor that intertwined with survival instincts. The terrain and timing of engagements further exacerbated resistance. Battles in forests, towns, and river crossings often favored defenders, giving German troops a psychological and tactical edge. Ambushes, fortified positions, and knowledge of local geography allowed them to inflict significant casualties while maintaining hope, however slim, of survival. Cultural and ideological factors also played a role. By 1944, the Nazi regime had imbued its soldiers with notions of ultimate sacrifice, loyalty, and the dishonor of surrender, particularly to what they considered foreign or overly aggressive enemies. American troops, with their bold, unconventional tactics and reputation for rapid, uncompromising advances, became the embodiment of the threat the regime had warned against. This created a mindset in which fighting to the last round was not only rational but expected. Eyewitness accounts from both sides describe scenes of chaotic, brutal resistance. Small units would engage in prolonged firefights, defend buildings with extreme tenacity, and counterattack even when surrounded. Tank crews would stay at their posts until destroyed, artillerymen would fire until overrun, and infantry squads would hold crossroads and bridges far beyond any reasonable tactical expectation. Morale played a paradoxical role. While many German soldiers were exhausted and demoralized, encounters with American forces often triggered heightened adrenaline and a grim determination. The immediacy of danger, combined with the fear of capture, sometimes led to acts of extraordinary resilience or extreme aggression.
This pattern was reinforced by the Americans themselves. Rapid advances, frequent use of combined arms, and an emphasis on shock tactics created environments where hesitation was dangerous and surrender seemed impossible or too risky. German soldiers observed these methods firsthand, learning that holding their ground was often the only option available if they wished to control the terms of their survival, however unlikely. Psychological studies conducted after the war highlighted the human factors at play: fear, perception of the enemy, past experiences, and cultural indoctrination all intersected to create a battlefield mentality that differed dramatically from encounters with the British. Individual decisions to resist to the death were not merely acts of stubbornness, but calculated responses to the perceived threat environment. In many cases, entire units were motivated by the knowledge that surrender could mean humiliation, punishment, or death. They chose to fight, even hopelessly, because the alternative was unknown and terrifying. The result was a pattern that historians describe as the American effect. German soldiers fought with extraordinary intensity, often beyond tactical reason, when facing Americans. The combination of fear, respect for enemy capability, and ideological pressure created a combustible mix that turned surrender into a last resort. These encounters produced some of the most brutal, high-casualty engagements on the Western Front, leaving lasting impressions on both sides. The intensity of resistance shaped the course of battles, slowed American advances, and forced Allied commanders to adapt strategies to counter unexpectedly fierce defense. Ultimately, the willingness of German soldiers to fight Americans to the death reveals the complex interplay of strategy, psychology, and culture in warfare. It was not merely about guns, tanks, or terrain. It was about perception, survival, and the human response to extreme threat. This chapter underscores a crucial lesson. In the chaos of war, who an enemy is can be as influential as what they wield. The choices of German soldiers were shaped not just by orders or equipment, but by fear, expectation, and the lived experience of combat. Understanding these dynamics allows us to see the Western Front not just as a sequence of battles, but as a deeply human theater where psychology and perception could be as deadly as any weapon.
As the fighting raged across the Western Front, it became clear that battlefield behavior was shaped by more than just immediate threats or tactical orders. Cultural and strategic influences played a decisive role in how German soldiers responded to different Allied forces. Training and doctrine instilled a sense of discipline and loyalty, yet the interpretation of these values was deeply colored by cultural perception. German soldiers were conditioned to respect hierarchy, follow orders, and hold positions as a demonstration of honor and duty. These teachings were reinforced by propaganda that glorified sacrifice and portrayed surrender as dishonorable, particularly when facing enemies perceived as aggressive or unpredictable. Yet culture was not limited to ideology alone. It encompassed perception of the enemy, experience with previous engagements, and expectations of treatment. Soldiers internalized stories and rumors about the British being measured and professional, while Americans were seen as rapid, chaotic, and relentless. This cultural lens influenced split-second decisions in combat, creating a psychological divide between whom to fight fiercely and whom to surrender to with relative ease. Strategy reinforced these cultural patterns. German commanders understood that the Western Front was collapsing under multiple pressures: overstretched supply lines, exhausted troops, and overwhelming Allied numbers. Field orders often emphasized delaying actions, holding key positions, or conducting tactical withdrawals designed to buy time. How soldiers interpreted these orders depended not only on their training, but also on their perceptions of the enemy's behavior. In towns, forests, and along rivers, local knowledge allowed German units to maximize defensive potential, yet the degree of resistance varied depending on who they faced. Against Americans, the combination of cultural indoctrination, fear, and the perceived ferocity of the attacker created intense, sometimes suicidal resistance. Against the British, the same units often opted for surrender, recognizing a more predictable and less threatening approach. Small differences in tactics amplified these effects.
British advances were measured with deliberate pauses and signals that conveyed control, offering German soldiers a sense of choice. American tactics emphasized shock and momentum, leaving no room for hesitation. Soldiers calculated the likely outcomes. Surrendering to the British could preserve life. Resisting Americans might be the only way to assert agency in an otherwise uncontrollable situation. Social factors within the German units also influenced behavior. Cohesion, camaraderie, and the desire to protect fellow soldiers encouraged collective decisions. If one group observed British forces treating captured comrades humanely, entire units were more likely to surrender. Conversely, fear of aggressive treatment by Americans often led to a unanimous determination to fight, even against overwhelming odds. Logistics played a subtle but significant role as well. Units low on ammunition, food, or medical support faced a more immediate reckoning, but even then, perception dictated their response. A German platoon with dwindling supplies might surrender to British forces, calculating survival, while fighting Americans to the last round, perceiving the alternative as too dangerous. Intelligence and reconnaissance further shaped outcomes. German soldiers frequently received fragmentary information about enemy strength and intentions. Interpreting this data through the lens of prior experience and cultural bias led to drastically different behaviors in seemingly similar situations. The strategic significance of surrender or resistance cannot be overstated. When German units surrendered to the British, it allowed Allied forces to advance with fewer casualties and reduced the strain on their resources. Fierce resistance against Americans, however, caused unexpected delays, high casualties, and required adaptive strategies to overcome. These dynamics reveal that battlefield outcomes were determined not only by weapons or numbers, but by a complex interplay of culture, psychology, and strategy. Personal psychology intertwined with broader cultural narratives. Fear, honor, indoctrination, and perceived risk combined to shape decisions under fire. Soldiers acted rationally within the framework of what they believed to be survival, loyalty, and duty, even when external observers might view their actions as irrational or extreme. In essence, the Western Front was a theater where human perception was as powerful as any weapon. Cultural and strategic factors created predictable patterns in behavior: surrender to the British, fierce resistance to Americans. This chapter highlights the importance of seeing warfare as a multidimensional human experience. It was not only about who held more firepower or controlled the terrain, but about expectations, perceptions, and psychological calculations of individual soldiers and units. By examining these influences, we gain a deeper understanding of how the war unfolded on a human level, beyond maps and statistics. The surrender of German soldiers to one enemy and their resistance to another was the product of strategy, culture, and perception interacting under the extreme pressures of combat. Recognizing this allows us to appreciate the subtle forces that shaped the final months of the Western Front and the remarkable, sometimes tragic decisions made by those caught in the maelstrom of war.
As the final months of the Western Front unfolded, the patterns of surrender and resistance among German soldiers revealed profound lessons about human behavior in warfare. The stark contrast between surrendering to British troops and fighting Americans to the last breath was not random, but the result of intertwined psychological, cultural, and strategic forces. By examining these dynamics, we uncover insights that go beyond traditional military history and into the very nature of human decision-making under extreme stress. One of the most striking lessons is the power of perception. German soldiers were constantly assessing threats, weighing the likelihood of survival, and interpreting enemy behavior. Surrender was not simply about fear or weakness. It was often a rational calculation based on observed treatment of prisoners, prior encounters, and the reputation of the opposing force. Conversely, fierce resistance against American troops was driven by fear of unpredictable retaliation, cultural indoctrination, and the pressing immediacy of danger. The Western Front demonstrates that the identity of the enemy shapes behavior as much as weapons or terrain. Psychological factors were magnified by ideology and indoctrination. Years of Nazi propaganda emphasized loyalty, honor, and sacrifice, while simultaneously demonizing certain enemies as ruthless and unforgiving. Soldiers internalized these narratives, which influenced their willingness to fight or surrender. These beliefs interacted with personal experience, creating powerful motivators that dictated battlefield decisions in ways that sometimes defied tactical logic. Strategic considerations also played a decisive role. German commanders understood the importance of delaying actions, defensive positions, and holding terrain, yet how soldiers interpreted orders depended on their perception of the threat and the credibility of their opponent. The British effect, with its measured discipline and humane treatment, provided an opportunity for survival. The American effect, with its rapid, aggressive assaults, created scenarios where resistance was perceived as the only option, even in hopeless situations. The interplay of culture, psychology, and strategy produced highly predictable patterns: surrender to those perceived as measured and honorable, relentless resistance to those perceived as aggressive and unpredictable. These patterns, repeated across battles and units, illustrate that warfare is as much a battle of minds as it is a contest of arms. Another critical lesson lies in human adaptability. German soldiers adjusted their behavior based on experience and observation. News of British fairness spread through ranks, reinforcing surrender behavior. Observations of American aggression reinforced resistance. The battlefield became a laboratory of human decision-making, where soldiers continually recalibrated choices to maximize survival, honor, or duty under extreme conditions. Understanding these dynamics also sheds light on the costs of war. Fierce resistance against American troops led to devastating casualties on both sides, prolonged engagements, and intensified destruction. Meanwhile, the willingness to surrender to the British allowed for preservation of life and resources, showing that human perception and psychological factors can have tangible strategic consequences. Finally, the Western Front teaches us about the complexity of human morality in warfare. Decisions to surrender or fight were rarely black and white. Soldiers balanced fear, honor, duty, and pragmatism, navigating impossible choices under the constant threat of death. Their actions reflect the nuanced, often contradictory nature of human behavior when survival and ideology collide. In reflecting on this, we see that the story of German soldiers on the Western Front is not merely a tale of tactics and battles, but a window into the human mind under extreme stress. Surrender and resistance were expressions of deeply human instincts shaped by perception, culture, experience, and circumstance. These patterns remind us that history is not only written by those who wield weapons, but also by those who perceive, interpret, and respond to the chaos around them. As the war drew to a close, these lessons remained. The decisions of individual soldiers, informed by psychology, culture, and strategy, could influence the course of battles, the survival of units, and the ultimate outcome of campaigns. Understanding why German soldiers surrendered to the British yet fought Americans to the death provides insight not only into World War II, but into the enduring truths about human behavior in the most extreme conditions imaginable. It is a testament to the complex, unpredictable, and deeply human nature of warfare, and a reminder that the choices made in moments of fear and uncertainty resonate far beyond the battlefield.